Good afternoon, my lord.
Good afternoon, Mr. Stephen. Now, you have another witness for me?
Yes, my lord. The next witness giving evidence today is B.D. Owens of the Scottish Artists' Union.
Very good. Good afternoon, Mr. Owens.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Right, there will be questions for you from Mr. Stephen when you're ready, Mr. Stephen.
Thank you, my lord. Could I start by asking you to confirm your full name, please?
My full name is B.D. Owens.
Thank you. You've helpfully provided a written statement to the inquiry already, and for the record that reference number is SCI-WT 0558-5 zeros and a 1. Just to reiterate at the outset that everything you've said in that written statement will be taken into account by the inquiry, even if we don't touch on every aspect of it in your evidence today. And just a gentle reminder that the hearing is being transcribed, so please do try and speak slowly and clearly in your answers, and I'll try and do the same. Thank you. Now, just to confirm, you're here today to give evidence on behalf of the Scottish Artists' Union, is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Could you please start by providing an overview of the key role or aims of the Scottish Artists' Union, please?
The Scottish Artists' Union is a trade union for visual and applied artists. We campaign and lobby for better working conditions, particularly within Fair Work framework. And we also, as you know, any other trade union, we have reps in casework and that kind of thing. As far as as far as visual artists, in case we're not aware of visual artists, that would be sculptors, painters, community artists, socially engaged artists. Applied artists would be weavers, ceramic artists, jewellery artists and jewellery designers, that kind of thing.
Thank you very much. You've given a flavour there of the types of artists that you represent. Could you say what the size of your membership is, both during the pandemic and now?
At the beginning of the pandemic, our membership was just over 1,000. We currently have 2,600 members.
Thank you. And your current role is as president of the Scottish Artists' Union, is that right?
That's correct.
And how long have you held that role for?
I've been in the role as a president since August 2022, and previously I was vice president.
And were you vice president during the pandemic period? That's
correct, yes.
Thank you. And your own background is as a visual artist, is that correct?
That's correct. I'm a sort of multidisciplinary artist, primarily based, my practice is primarily based in sculpture and also performance art as well.
And you've worked in different countries in that capacity, is that right?
That's correct. I've worked in Canada as well as Germany and Scotland, yeah.
Thank you. Now, before we get to the pandemic and any impacts of that, I want to start first with the practical reality, I suppose, of how artists operate, how they work their businesses. Now, at paragraph 68 of your witness statement, you say that many artists have, I think, multiple sources of income. Could you explain to the inquiry a little bit as to why that is for artists, why that arrangement exists?
Generally speaking, artists have to draw from or kind of have a sort of a hybrid practice, both within their own practice, as in you know, the kinds of artworks they do to make different kinds of money. So, for example, a single artist may be making income from having exhibitions, but they might also be making income from presenting workshops on the kind of work that they're doing, and workshops and skills training for not just for members of the community, so kind of socially engaged, but also skills training for other artists as well, kind of sharing knowledge. They also might be giving artist talks. They might be doing research and writing for publications. They might be doing research for universities, so that they're kind of drawing from lots of different aspects within their art practice. But they also sometimes have kind of hybrid modes of income where they work in other sectors as well. So, for example, they might work part-time as an employee in a hospitality sector or retail sector or public transport. For example, in public transport as a ticket collector. They might also work in construction or as a sanitation worker. So in these situations, they would work part-time, maybe a couple of days a week, and the rest of the time they'd be working on their art practice and drawing income from there. So there's kind of like complications for how much they, basically they're doing these other modes of work to kind of stabilize their ability to work on their art practice. Does that make sense?
It does. So that second stream of income would help to sustain them beyond perhaps what they would earn from simply being an artist.
Exactly.
Thank you. Now, in terms of ways of working for artists, at paragraph 24 of your witness statement, you say, I think, that most art practices are carried out contract to contract. Is that correct?
That's usually the case, yes. And sometimes the contracts are very short, but sometimes the lucky ones, maybe they have kind of a artists in residence type scenario where, particularly if they're doing community type art. So they're embedded within the community. So sometimes those contracts can be, between 6 weeks and 6 months, and occasionally longer, but not usually. It's sort of that kind of turnaround. So there's kind of peaks and troughs of times that artists are working, and sometimes they have gaps between the times that they're working.
And given those gaps, can therefore income, for example, be unpredictable for artists, even out with the pandemic period, which obviously the inquiry is looking at? Precisely.
I mean, most artists know this. So this is one of the reasons why they might have the part-time job situation. And sometimes those part-time jobs might even be 0 hours contracts. Or kind of casual type scenarios, but also they will probably, most artists that I know have built up savings in order to be able to cover them during the periods of time that they're not engaged in a contract. But it's sort of, it can be, that can also cause kind of additional stress. And the other thing is that when they are on these contracts, usually they're trying to book in contracts ahead of time. So, for example, one of the problems at the beginning of the pandemic is that a number of artists, had work booked, in advance that they were expecting and depending on, and that fell through. So because, everything collapsed and there just wasn't anything. Certainly for the in-person in-person stuff. There was, as we've discussed before, and as I've said in my statement, there was a shift to an expectation to shift online.
Well, we'll come to the impact of the pandemic in a second. No, forgive me, but don't worry, we'll come to that in a second, I promise. Earlier on in your evidence, you mentioned workshops, and I just wanted to check on that. Prior to the pandemic, how significant were those in-person, face-to-face workshops or other activities to an artist's income? How significant a proportion would those have been?
Oh, some artists, that's all they do. That's their primary mode of income. Whether that be them delivering workshops actually from their own studio space, or they might be working for an arts organisation where they're delivering on a particular premises, and that would be they would be contracted to do that. But yeah, like hugely significant, and a huge number of artists as well. But the ones that are presenting workshops, that's often a big part of their income, for sure.
Thank you. And how many of your members would be hiring or own a studio or space to enable these activities to take place?
I don't know that precise number, but definitely a significant amount. We recently did a survey that actually included artists that like across Scotland, so it wasn't specifically for our members. But I think the range in that survey, I think there was around about 500 artists who took part in that survey. Some of them had to give up their studios because they couldn't afford it, so we had that as part of the question. So I think that there was around about, I'm guesstimating here, around about 400 within that survey that were we were gathering data on whether they could afford their studios, basically. So that's sorry.
Thank you. I want to move then to the pandemic, and you touched on this slightly earlier on, so we'll go to it now. At paragraph 46 of your statement, I think you say there was an assumption made that all artists would be able to transition their practices online during the pandemic, and you say in that paragraph that that was not possible due to a number of factors. Could you please outline for the inquiry what those factors were?
Part of the problem was that the practicalities of the kinds of art practices that the sort of so, for example, the skills workshops, it's difficult to mentor somebody how to, for example, throw a ceramic. If you're throwing on a wheel, it's really difficult to show that over a video. Or if you're doing kind of intricate examples of techniques for sort of soldering or in jewellery design, or casting, or those kinds of hands-on, also kind of weaving techniques, etc. It's really difficult to do that. But also, lots of people just didn't have the experience, and maybe they didn't have adequate internet. I live rurally. Like at the beginning of the pandemic, our internet was rubbish, and that affected my ability to bring my practice online as well. So,
and that point you make there about living rurally, did you receive feedback from your members more broadly that was an issue? The inquiry is obviously interested in many things, but including digital inclusion or exclusion. Was feedback from artists that were your members, were they making a similar point to the one you just made, that their internet access or otherwise was rendering it difficult for them to run their businesses during the pandemic?
Definitely. Definitely, certainly, especially people in Highlands areas, and some of the Highlands areas, didn't even have 4G coverage as well, so they couldn't do they couldn't even do the internet Wi-Fi kind of hotspot on their phones with their computers, etc. So, but also just also the confidence as well of moving online. It's a very, very different scenario from being in person. As you'll know, even in meetings as well, connecting with, if you're trying to teach or kind of do demonstration workshops, it's just a different dynamic.
And at the end of the day, these are people's livelihoods. So I wanted to ask you this as well. Was there a question over being able to generate an income from these online activities, or was that an issue that your members identified to you, or not?
Yeah, yes, indeed. As you're probably aware, lots of people expect to get online content for free. So if an individual was not already, an individual artist was not already set up with an online platform that they were, able to make income from advertising or other kinds of revenue previous to the pandemic, and that they already had a following, that kind of situation is very difficult to build up. And there was also a lot of free content during the pandemic, so that there was this extra competition, competing with content that people were going to be able to access for free. So there was an expectation. I think that in certain circumstances that was somewhat mitigated if there was an arts organisation that commissioned an artist to make a work that they were presenting online, so they could get kind of income and revenue that way. But if they were trying to transfer kind of their self-employed practice that they were kind of delivering workshops, etc., that it was going to be very hard for them to make an income online from that.
Thank you. And I think you also make the point in your statement at paragraph 49 that I think you yourself give a personal example of having to pay a technician to help you to do the work that wouldn't have been necessary if you weren't having to do things online. So you're having to spend money to deliver your work.
Absolutely. So, for example, I was commissioned to do this piece of work, and the way it was going to be delivered was quite complicated, and therefore I needed technicians to support me in that, and also, the arts organisation recognised that. So they did contribute some money towards the technicians, but I also had to pay technicians to kind of help me to get it ready to get to that point, because I wasn't familiar with that particular way of presenting work at that time. And that was the only work that was available to me in that period. So I was in a situation, as you say, I had to spend money in order to make money. And I think that was the case for other artists as well. Again, even if they weren't being commissioned, maybe they were, in order to try and make the income, they were spending money to get technical help from others in order to be able to present their work.
Thank you. And even when lockdowns had ended, was there still a reticence from either artists or participants in things like workshops to resume these face-to-face activities that had been commonplace before the pandemic? Was that something that your members encountered?
Yes, not only from a point of view of the artists concerned about exposing themselves to COVID, but also workshop participants were less likely to want to go to an indoor, maybe a small studio space, in order to learn new skills. And with thinking about distancing, there were way fewer people that would be able to be in that space. Therefore, they're less likely to make as much income because there are fewer people kind of paying a fee to do the workshop. Does that make sense? So it's not only a reticence from a safety aspect, but is it going to be worth it to them to do this project because there's not going to be enough people for them to make an income?
And in making that calculation, was it the experience of your members that some artists decided not to run those workshops for that reason?
That's correct, and there's definitely been quite a lag time for many months, well after lockdown, well after the kind of the restrictions ended, that the artists started doing workshops in their studios again. There is something to consider as well, and I'm not sure if this is the point to bring it in, but in 2023, and we submitted this as part of my statement. We did a member survey, kind of reflecting on the pandemic period, and 40% of our members surveyed said they had caring responsibilities. 33% were disabled or had a long-term illness lasting more than a year, and 25% were neurodivergent. Neurodivergent meaning dyslexia, dyspraxia, and autism. So there's, we've talked to researchers and that kind of do research in other art sectors, and apparently the literary sector has kind of similar kind of demographics. So thinking about these particular members, they were maybe thinking about things in many kind of complicated ways. So maybe they were also reticent to start doing work post-pandemic because of their own needs around disability or neurodivergence or illness as well. So they didn't want to expose themselves, and also just kind of economic precarity within those groups.
The inquiry is interested at this stage, obviously, in impacts, but also disproportionate impacts. Those groups that you've mentioned, are they examples in your evidence of groups of artists who were disproportionately impacted by what happened during the pandemic?
From what I've heard from our members, yes, people with caring responsibilities, for example, certainly during the lockdown periods, they were, if they were caring for children, they were also having to consider the homeschool situation, which then, if they're also trying to work from home on their practice and, look after kids and make sure that they're learning, that's going to impact their practice. In terms of disabled and neurodivergent, disabled people who have compromised immune systems, even after the restrictions kind of lifted. I said that previously, but it's not just for being an artist. It's not just about doing the work; it's about getting the work. So you have to show up and be present and interact with your peers within artist events, so that people know you, so that curators know you, so that you get commissioned. And if you're not present, then you're probably not going to get the work. So that's going to definitely have impacted people with compromised immune systems. In terms of neurodivergence, dyslexia, dyscalculia, that's going to affect people's abilities to maybe even apply for grants. In terms of, I realise that you're going to talk about we're going to ask a question perhaps about the grants, so I'll maybe get onto that in a bit.
In due course, yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Were you aware of any of your members as artists that decided to leave their art practices altogether as a result of the financial impacts or difficulties they faced during the pandemic?
I'm aware that there are. I think that there are percentages within the surveys, but I don't know which percentages left. I can say that we did 2 surveys, one which was early on in the pandemic, and one that was kind of later in the pandemic, or sort of later in 2020, that we did with Scottish Contemporary Art Network. But they have kind of similar percentages. 95% of respondents to the SCU Artist Safety Net survey reported that they had to change their approach to their working practice in lockdown. So that kind of reflects on what I was talking about earlier. Of those in self-employed roles, said that COVID-19 had an impact on their, so 92% had an impact on their self-employed and working conditions. So, if people are generally finding it much more challenging to be able to do the work that they have been doing and dependent on for income, and that's suddenly very challenging, then that's going to make them question whether they're going to be able to continue. There are percentages in, I think, the survey that we did with SCAN that talk about how many people left.
And the inquiry has your statement, and it will be taken into account, so don't worry if the specific figures don't spring to mind. Before moving on, I did want to ask you, though, specifically about the impact of artists' ability to pay for their studio space At paragraph 45 of your statement, I think you say that 55% of the artists that were surveyed by the Scottish Artists Union said that the pandemic had impacted, I think, a great deal or a lot in terms of their abilities to pay for that space. And I think at paragraph 95, that's something which you say is still a concern of artists, their ability to be able to pay for that. So is that something in your evidence that is a longer term effect or concern arising from the pandemic?
I think there are several sort of complicating factors. Firstly, because there was scarcity in the ability to make income, scarcity of opportunities from that they might have previously had from arts organisations, but because the arts organisations weren't providing those opportunities in the same amount, and they weren't able to make an income perhaps from presenting workshops in their spaces, like I mentioned earlier, but also kind of on the back of the pandemic, there was also the cost of living crisis, which affected the studio providers, and their overheads went up. So then they're, with the energy costs, etc., and the studio providers weren't able to make an income from doing events in their spaces, because some of the studio providers have large halls that they might have festivals in and actually gain an income from that. So that was transferred onto the artists. So it's sort of a kind of a layered, complicating factor. So the studio providers increased their rent, and that means the artists who are not making the income that they were previously are therefore not able to pay for the space that they make their income in. So it's sort of, I don't know, have I answered the question? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, thank you. I want to move on then to the financial support that was available to artists during the pandemic. In paragraph 58 of your witness statement, I think you say that early in the pandemic the self-employed were forgotten and a lot of artists fell through the gaps and didn't meet the requirements for furlough. Could you just explain to the inquiry why you hold that view and why artists were unable to access that funding and fell through the gaps, as you put it?
Again, there's a few complicating factors. It's not one specific thing. So going back to my earlier, when I was talking earlier about the kind of the hybrid nature of artist income, if an artist isn't only making their income from art practice, and they're not making enough money within that self-employed area to meet the assessment requirement for the self-employed COVID benefit, but they're also perhaps in a situation where they're working a couple of days a week in another employment job, which might have vanished because in a hospitality sector, many of the hospitality jobs just disappeared. So they wouldn't have been eligible within that. Plus, many artists invest back into their practice. So on paper, it looks like they haven't earned as much as they have because they might have invested in specialist tools or other kind of sort of structural stuff within their business to be able to do their work. So also if they were transitioning out of employment work into self-employed art practice, and they hadn't been self-employed long enough, and they hadn't met the self-employed income kind of assessment requirements, then yeah, all of those circumstances, plus there are lots of artists that simply don't make as much from their self-employment practice. So maybe they're just starting out, or maybe they perhaps have had to take time off because they're ill, or perhaps to have children. So none of these things were really taken into account, that there was this sort of expectation that people fit into really specific boxes, and if you didn't fit into these boxes, then you weren't taken into account. Also, some of our members are older and maybe have worked in a different sector and have pensions, so they're making a part of their I guess income from pension, but they're maybe depending on their art practice income to actually have a decent income. So yeah, if their art practice income kind of fell away, then they would just be depending on their pensions. So have I answered the question?
Yes, thank you. And you said in your answer there, I think, that none of this was taken into account. Can I ask if the Scottish Artists Union made these points about mixed employment status of artists? Was this something that was made known to the Scottish Government? And if so, how and when, if you recall?
This was, discussed certainly within the Creative Industries Trade Unions group. I don't know if you want me to talk a bit about that. Yeah. Please,
it'd be helpful. Yeah, I mean, yes, if you recall how often this issue might have been raised, or even just in broad brush terms, the membership of that group, without naming individuals, how that group was composed, that would be helpful.
The Creative Industries Trade Unions group didn't quite exist formally before the pandemic. The Scottish Trade Union Congress brought the Creative Industries Trade Unions groups together to assess how this was affecting the different creative sector trade unions, so Equity, Musicians Union, back to Society of Scottish Playwrights, National Union of Journalists, ourselves, and eventually the Society of Authors joined as well. The point of that group was to assess the different complicating factors across the sectors, because not everybody's members, not all of the union's members were experiencing the pandemic in the same way, but there were many similarities. So it was a way to kind of pool evidence, figure out specific safety protocols as well. And also, like the first meetings that we had was just with the trade unions, and then the STUC chair organised meetings with Scottish Government officials. And then we were having these meetings twice a month, every month, and we still do. Like it's continued on. I'm not exactly sure if I answered the question.
You have. I mean, at this stage, the inquiry is interested in impacts, but it's helpful to know that the issue that you mentioned was raised with the Scottish Government. So thank you. I want to move on then to talk about the Creative Scotland Bridging Bursary Fund. If I may, this is something you mentioned specifically in your statement at paragraph 73 onwards. First of all, when did that fund become available, if you recall, and who was eligible to apply for funding underneath it?
I apologise, I haven't written in my statement the date that it actually came about. It was relatively early on in the pandemic. The second, the second phase was the hardship fund. So going back to the Creative Industries Trade Unions Group, there was also a representative from Creative Scotland there. The kind of within our talks, I mean, they were hearing the feedback from us and the necessary reasons for emergency funding. One of the really helpful things I'll say about the bridging fund, bridging bursary, going back to the kind of folks in our union that have dyslexia and dyscalculia, it was deliberately an easy application. It was specifically for people who were in immediate need, who had lost work, who were depending on work to, put food on the table, pay their rent, and not only from their art practice, but just living expenses. It was a first come, first served, so it was used up pretty quickly. So what they did is they kind of released them in sort of tranches. So it would be open for a period, it would run out, then they'd reopen it, and then it would run out, etc. One of the things that was a negative, other than the fact that it ran out pretty quickly, some artists didn't apply even although they were eligible because they felt others must have been in greater need. Some of them asked for less than they actually needed because they were worried if they actually asked for what they, the amount that they needed, they wouldn't get it if they asked for too much. In the second, just to comment on that, I think that is partially related to the sort of psychological conditions or conditioning that artists are, when they apply for grants in a competitive, scarce arts funding environment, they tend to apply for less than they actually need because they're worried they're not going to get it. So that unfortunately translated into this situation with the emergency funding, which I don't think that was really considered. If it had been perhaps a flat rate, you apply, you get this amount, I think that would have been psychologically more fair. And I don't, I think it was an accidental thing. I don't think it was deliberate. The second phase that came out in the second phase of a distribution that came out in October 2020, it was called the Hardship Fund for Creative Freelancers, and this was distributed through Craft Scotland, Visual Arts Scotland, Society of Authors, Help Musicians, and back to, and it was in the form of one-off payments in the amounts between 500 and 2,000. Again, the eligibility requirements were on the ability to prove that you as the freelancer, that you're a creative freelancer resident in Scotland and in immediate need of financial difficulty due to the pandemic, and also not eligible for other forms of support. But going back to the kind of amounts between 500 and 2,000, the default probably, I'm speculating, psychologically people would sort of apply for less than they actually need. So that's one of the negatives from that. Other than that, it was, our feedback was everybody who applied and got the fund was massively appreciative of it, and it definitely did what it was supposed to do, kind of tied them over until they could get work.
Thank you. And what was the Scottish Artists Union's overall view on whether that financial support from these funds, you mentioned the two phases, first of all the bursary fund and the hardship fund, were they sufficient to support artists during the pandemic? You said it was welcome. Was it enough?
No. I mean, we can compare it. We can compare it to kind of, the other workers that maybe got furlough, but I realise that is a, UK government, and this is, we're talking about kind of what the Scottish government could do. I recognise that, but given the already precariousness of artist practice, given the already precariousness and competition, increased competition for funding, because the arts funding already at the beginning of the pandemic, there'd been a funding freeze. So there was scarce money coming into the sector. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't consistent enough. I talked in my statement about, what took place in Canada. I don't know if you want me to talk about that now or
It's your evidence to give, but I was going to ask you, part of the inquiry's role is obviously to think about lessons learned, what the Scottish Government might realistically or reasonably do differently if there was another pandemic, or to mitigate the effects of that pandemic. So certainly I would intend to ask you, what you think may be done differently in that regard.
Looking at Canada, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, UNESCO reported that the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit was a lifeline for self-employed artists and culture workers. It's actually called, it's used the initials CERB, so CERB. The CERB led to an almost, and this is like across Canada, so this is not specifically artists, but the CERB led to an almost 20% drop in overall poverty in Canada, and it reduced child poverty by 40%. Obviously that's a massive impact. The British Columbia government also issued a temporary rental supplement, which offered $500 a month to help renters pay for the months of April and May, which, that was their initial lockdown. So British Columbia government also provided a one-time tax-free $1,000 payment to BC residents whose ability to work was affected due to COVID-19. So, you know, artists, you know, could have fallen into that category as well. Initially, the SERB was so the SERB was paid out $500 a week to individuals for a maximum of 16 weeks, but this was extended to 24 weeks. There wasn't, you know, there wasn't a complicated application process for the SERB either. It was really, really simple. So in that way, it was really accessible. You know, I've said in my statement, you know, there was a negative for the SERB that you had to prove that you had earned in the previous year to be eligible. You had to have earned $5,000. But apart from that, you know, like I said, the UNESCO report said it was a lifeline for self-employed artists, and I think that we can definitely learn from that. The kind of considering also the Scottish Government had put restrictions on, you know, a ban on temporary evictions as well for residential rents. You know, that certainly was, and also kind of a rental freeze. That certainly was, on one hand, a good thing, but it also had kind of knock-on effects with, as we know, there's, and I've mentioned in our statement, in our statement, that there's there was a number of knock-on effects to that, where landlords were, after the rental freeze, they were raising rents kind of 40, 50, and sometimes 80%. So in terms of kind of taking, obviously, again, this is something that isn't exclusive to artists. This affects, you know, everyone. But these are things I think definitely should be taken into account for sure. Another thing that was a really good positive from the Scottish Government, which, again, I don't think has necessarily been considered, because it wasn't specifically a COVID benefit, like a COVID grant or payment. It existed before the pandemic, and that's the Scottish Union Learning Fund. Our union was already receiving Scottish Union Learning Fund money to pay for learning organisers, and also kind of development money to deliver training workshops, which this was a really, really key, important factor in our ability to shift and transition online much faster. It meant that we were able to provide support and training workshops to our members in situations where previously that had been in person. We kind of, our organisers, they were amazing. They kind of transferred online workshops, skills workshops, really, really, and you know, targeted specific areas that our members needed to learn quickly in order to kind of, you know, be able to, you know, potentially transition online and bring their practices online, even although, as I said before, for practical reasons, whether that's their own delivery or whether it's the participants that were learning weren't able to do that in their own homes. But certainly the Scottish Union Learning Fund, thinking about that as a way to distribute money into trade unions that then can help trade union members, and a lot of our workshops were also open just to anybody. So it wasn't exclusively to our members. They weren't kind of closed off, like artists that weren't members could take part, and also members of other trade unions as well, if it was relevant to them. So the other thing is it gave us the ability to reach across Scotland and have kind of and this is something that we hadn't considered, particularly that moving online. That it helped us to kind of reach and connect with members, and members with each other, not just with us. And also kind of the learning team also helped us set up subgroups and working groups so that members could actually take part in the workings of the union. So all of these things that we hadn't really considered. I mean, I've put part of this in my statement, but I've been reflecting on this recently because we were just writing another grant and reflecting on just how valuable that particular funding stream was. Also, the Union Modernisation Fund as well, although that particular funding stream doesn't exist anymore. But this, the Scottish Union Learning Fund, is coming through the Scottish Government, through Scottish Union Learning and STUC, and then going to the trade unions was incredibly valuable.
Thank you very much. My Lord, I don't have any further questions to ask this witness, subject to anything you wish to ask or add.
No, I've got nothing to add, thank you. All that remains for me to do is to thank you, Mr. Owens. That's all, and we'll come back at 2:30. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, my lord.
Good afternoon, Mr. Turner. Now, the next witness, the last witness for the day is?
The last witness for the week, my lord, is Mr. Tasker. Mr. Ian Tasker from Scottish Hazards.
Very good. Good afternoon, Mr. Tasker.
Good afternoon, my lord.
You'll be asked questions by Mr. Turner when you're ready, Mr. Turner.
Thank you, my lord. Good afternoon, Mr. Tasker.
Good afternoon.
First of all, Mr. Tasker, just to say, this afternoon's hearing will be transcribed. If you and I could try to speak slowly and clearly, that will help the stenographer significantly. Could you please state your full name?
Ian Tasker.
And you're here today representing Scottish Hazards, is that correct?
That is correct.
And could you just confirm your position with Scottish Hazards?
Chief Executive Officer.
Thank you. And in respect of this hearing, Mr. Tasker, you've provided a written statement, is that correct?
That is correct.
And for the record, my lord, that is SCI WT 03773. You've also provided a previous statement, Mr. Tasker, and that's SCI WT 03771 in respect of the health and social care hearings. And you previously gave oral evidence to the inquiry on the 1st of May, is that correct?
That's correct.
And the transcript for that, my lord, is SCI TRN SPT 41. Mr. Tasker, in respect of today's hearing, we're here to talk about your most recent statement. Everything within that statement, and indeed any other documents that you've provided to the inquiry, will be taken into account. We do have a limited amount of time today, and therefore we may not touch upon everything within that statement, but that will still be part of the record of the inquiry and will be taken fully into account by His Lordship. Just by way of recap, if I may, Mr. Tasker, on the 1st of May, you described Scottish Hazards to His Lordship as follows. Scottish Hazards is an occupational health and safety charity that provides health and safety advice, representation and support to people who are not in trade unions, so therefore don't enjoy that trade union premium in relation to health and safety work. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And you confirmed that during the COVID pandemic, you provided advice, primarily through a helpline that was rebranded ultimately as the COVID helpline. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. And your oral description of Scottish Hazards is actually reflected at paragraph 9 of your most recent statement, which says, Scottish Hazards aims to provide support to vulnerable workers, whether workers, employees, or the technically self-employed who do not otherwise enjoy the protection of a recognised trade union.
That's correct.
Thank you. Could you assist us, Mr. Tasker, in terms of who those vulnerable workers are?
I mean, certainly in relation to COVID, vulnerable workers were those who were at most at risk should they contract COVID. But you know, a lot of the people that we deal with outside COVID are those that, as we said, are not in trade unions, but they're carrying out precarious work of whatever kind. It's you know, I think the lack of security that many workers have is where we try to assist those that don't have that security of employment. We get quite a few callers with health and safety issues from the hospitality industry. Again, 0-hour contracts, which I think adds to the overall reluctance to actually raise health and safety issues with the employer, because they won't get the work if they do so. So it's hard. It sometimes puts a big barrier on how successful we can be in supporting these people if we can't intervene with the employers.
Thank you. You mentioned their precarious contracts, 0-hour contracts. Are there any particular demographic of individual who tend to be vulnerable more than others?
It's a range of ages, basically, because we certainly find that people are in these kind of jobs, are in particularly 0-hour contract jobs, because it doesn't provide the income they require, but it's probably better for their individual circumstances, such as childcare, or at the other, the opposite end, where they've got care for elderly parents or other relatives.
Thank you. And through your work in the helpline, if I could speak to you about that for a moment, could you give His Lordship an indication of how many cases you handled over the pandemic?
On the date that we started recording cases properly, which was probably June 2020, when we rebranded the helpline, clearly that was some 3 months after the lockdown, but there'd been a steady trickle before that time. But since we started recording cases, there was approximately 460 contacts of various complexity, it has to be said.
And how many of those related to business and support and guidance?
I think the vast majority related to, at some level, in relation to the failure by the employers to interpret guidance that was coming out, and that's not a criticism of employers, because there was a lot of guidance coming out. Where we could step in was some employers would accept, when the guidance was put in front of them, that they weren't following that guidance. Others would not accept that, and that's where we had to perhaps take another course of action to try and resolve the issues.
Thank you. Could we have a look at paragraph 18, please, of your statement? Thank you. You indicated in your statement, Mr. Tasker, about 320 cases related to business support. You said the vast majority of it.
Yeah.
Would that be the correct number?
That would be around right, yeah.
Thank you. And in relation to the type of people that you were assisting through the helpline, both in terms of the industry and ultimately in respect of the role they were playing within that, who was actually seeking advice through the helpline?
It mostly came from the workers themselves, and really they'd got our contact details through the guidance that was being circulated by the Scottish government. But we had a number of cases where it was spouses who were contacting Scottish Hazards on behalf of concerns they had about their partners' workplaces, and these cases tend to come from females who were contacting us in relation to problems their male partners were having at their workplaces, which I thought at the time was quite interesting. But again, quite clearly, I think in that case, as in a lot of things, males were less likely to want to assert their rights in the workplace. And
you're saying workplace there. What kinds of workplaces was it? Were there any particular, or was there a breadth of those?
I mean, we dealt with people that worked in micro businesses. We dealt with people who worked in small businesses, and we dealt with people who worked for larger employers. It was mainly larger employers where they had concerns about things their employers were doing or were not doing, including return to work, etc. But it's hard to say that we dealt with any area, any kind of workplace more than others.
If we could ask the question the other way, was there a diversity of workplaces that you dealt with?
Yeah, very much so. From construction to hospitality, as it is listed there. But it's and again, my background was within trade unionism, and I'd not engaged with smaller workplaces in that role, and I was surprised by the challenges that particularly the smaller and medium enterprises pose for myself as an experienced trade union official, and that is something that I don't think we really looked at, or the Scottish Government looked at, in relation to the support that these businesses got. They got some level of support through ourselves during COVID, but we need to look at what's going to happen if there is another pandemic.
Still looking at paragraph 18 of your statement there, which I think you just alluded to a second ago. You say these workers came from a variety of workplaces, including hospitality workers, office workers, admin workers, factory workers, retail workers, manufacturers, electricians, engineers, construction workers, drivers, joiners, cleaners, carpet fitters, and third sector employees. So quite a breadth of places there.
And a lot of them were working for UK-wide employers, which caused issues in itself, because the guidance, I think, elsewhere in the UK was totally different to the guidance that was being published by the Scottish Government.
Thank you. Did any employers contact you?
Yeah, and during both lockdowns, as restrictions were being eased, we had approaches from, I would say, probably at the most about 30 or 40 employers, and mainly micro employers, and focusing in. Most of these came from the hair and beauty industry, because clearly they'd had to close during the first lockdown and the second, and the second lockdown, and clearly they were seeking advice on what they needed to do. They'd accessed the guidance from the Scottish Government. Many of them they'd thought about what they needed to do. So it was just a case of our confirming with them that they were either right or there's other areas they needed to look at in order to reopen safely. And the main issue was in relation to any work in front of faces. So it was beard trimming, and other treatments where the individual had to be in front of the person's face and still, and where it was quite clear that there could be transmission through that person breathing on them.
Thank you. Looking at workers in particular, you mentioned a moment ago there was a reluctance. I think in particular you said males were reluctant, but a reluctance generally to raise health and safety issues with employers. Are you able to assist His Lordship in understanding why that might be the case?
I think it's down to the fact that they had no effective voice. An effective voice is the main dimension of fair work, and it was quite clear. Many of these workplaces did not have health and safety committees, for instance. There was no consultation on health and safety, and that signified to us that there was a lack of effective voice. And if there is a lack of effective voice in the workplace, who's actually going to represent these people? And again, if they were on 0-hour contracts, or even even if they were on short-term contracts, there was this reluctance to assert their rights, basically, because what was happening in some cases was wrong. It was against health and safety legislation, and there was the employers, and it was not every employer, but the employers that were not carrying out risk assessments and not consulting were in breach of the law.
You mentioned the lack of effective voice. did or were Scottish Hazards able to provide an effective voice for employees in those circumstances?
The way that we would do that, and again, in the few cases where the individual would let us contact the employer or let us contact the Scottish Government on their behalf, we had some successes because, and it only, I mean, we contacted, and I don't know if we want to go into individual cases at this point, but we contacted a number of employers, and we got various levels of responses, it has to be said, and we, on half a dozen occasions, we went to the Scottish Government, and they contacted the employer to point out that they were in breach of the guidance that was actually in place at the time.
You said there you got various levels of responses. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
Well, in relation to there was an issue in relation to a company that provides meter reading for utility companies, and they were actually instructing their employees to go into houses to read meters on the basis that this was a safety issue, and we disagreed with that, and we contacted the company, and they would not shift. They said these meter readers carry out crucial health and safety checks of the equipment in that house. We pointed out that was no more than a visual inspection, and really it was more about checking that the meter had not been tampered with. So we contacted the Scottish Government. They agreed with our view that this was not an essential service, and we could relay that back to the individual who had contacted us and the company, and that was resolved. But what they actually did, because it was a case in the Borders, they transferred that meter reader to go and do readings of meters south of the border, where this was not an issue. So, and there was another one in relation to a nationwide cleaning company whose website quite clearly was given it was given guidance in relation to the situation in England and Wales, and not in relation to Scotland, where it was totally different, because at that time, at that time, home cleaning should not have been taking place. We contacted the Scottish Government, and this led to the situation in relation to essential work and working in people's houses being redefined. Because what they actually said in relation to that cleaning case, was that if the individual was incapable of carrying out their own cleaning, then they could employ outside cleaners, providing all the other safeguards were in place in relation to social distancing, etc. But that was not the case in England, where it seemed to have been that domestic cleaning could still take place.
Thank you. You mentioned there, I think, a moment ago that on occasion you were effectively able to intervene on the part of employees. I take it from that there were occasions where you weren't able to intervene on behalf of the employees, or they weren't keen for you to intervene on behalf of the employees. Was that the case? That
was the case in the majority of our cases, unfortunately.
And why was that?
Again, it's down to the lack of representation, and it's just down to the fact that people were, I think they were scared that they lost their jobs. They were far more scared that they actually caught COVID, and it was a strange situation where people were, and quite often in tears with us, saying that they were scared to go to work, but if they did go to work, they were scared that they would catch COVID, because there was no risk assessments done in that workplace. So it was, and again, these were the minority of the cases, it has to be said, but I think there were serious issues in relation to this whole thing about, and I don't know whether it's trust or lack of trust. This came in relation to working at home as well, that without that intermediary to actually engage at an early stage, and I would say this is even before we launched our helpline, if employers had been aware of their legal obligations to do risk assessments and to consult, we might not have had that reluctance further down the line when we were basically firefighting. And I don't think, certainly in the second lockdown, it wasn't a case of putting profit before people. It was more about putting survival before the people, which, business survival, I should say, before the people. But to us, I think the workers should still come first, because without your workforce, you're not going to have a business either.
You mentioned there, Mr. Tasker, the lack of someone to intervene. Obviously, Scottish Hazards provides that role in some respects, but if it's not Scottish Hazards, who is around to intervene?
There's nobody. There's absolutely nobody in relation to. There's obviously citizens' advice bureaus, but they were directing people towards us because they don't have the specialism to actually engage on health and safety at work. They were obviously doing work in relation to benefits and access to benefits, but really there's nobody else that does the kind of work that we do. In Scotland.
And just to be clear, Mr. Tasker, in that regard, you're talking about nobody doing the kind of work you're doing, working with non-unionised workers.
Yeah. In
contrast to, for example, unionised workers who might have that representation through their union, for example.
Yeah, that's correct. We also engage with a number of a number of non-union members that worked in unionised workplaces. But our view, we would provide advice, we would provide the representation if required, but it was on the basis that they actually joined the recognised trade union in that workplace.
Thank you. I want to talk very briefly, we've talked about your work with the employers and trying to shift them, and obviously with the Scottish Government as well. I'd like to talk about some of the other sort of partners that Scottish Hazards have been working with, and you mentioned in your oral evidence the Partnership on Health and Safety in Scotland, PHASS,
yeah.
And your involvement with the Scottish Government's Safer Workplaces Advisory Group. So, if you don't mind, I won't touch on them so much today, but I would just like to touch very briefly with your partnerships with local authorities. Did you work with local authorities?
We did. There was two heads of service, environmental health heads of service that sat on the Safer Workplace group, and it's two respected head of service, and we through that involvement in the Safer Workplaces group, we had access to them to get some advice, even if it wasn't in connection with their own local authorities. In relation to direct contact with local authorities and specific cases, that was not so good. When we contacted the local authorities, it was an answering machine, and we were contacting them because we thought there needed to be some action, in relation to enforcement in the workplaces they have responsibility for, and the individuals that were contacting us were expecting a response reasonably quickly, but we never really. Again, I think the one that we, the ones that we got some result were in workplaces within the 2 local authorities that these individuals that I referred to earlier were actually the heads of service.
Right, so that you were able to engage with directly through the Safer Workplaces group?
Yeah.
And do I take it from that you struggled in other places without that direct contact?
Yeah, and I'm not being critical of local authorities, but these departments were under a lot. They were under a lot of pressure because they were the regular. They provided enforcement activity for public health. Under the Public Health Scotland Act 2008. So, if they were being pushed by Public Health Scotland and by the health protection units in relation to workplace outbreaks, then clearly that was taking priority, and rightly so, over providing support to organisations like ours. And I think that's indicative of the lack of resources that we now have in local authority environmental health departments, the challenges they've got in relation to food standards and other areas of responsibility, but also in relation to the UK-wide regulator, the Health and Safety Executive.
Speaking of resources, Mr. Tasker, we're obviously hearing some great things about the work that you were doing. Did you receive, Scottish Hazards receive financial support for your work during the pandemic?
Yeah, that came through the Safer Workplaces group in the very early days, and that's how we started to, I think, be more careful about how we were collating cases, because every month we submitted a report to the Safer Workplaces group, and every case that we had engaged with were summarised in relation to that report, and I think they've been submitted to the inquiry. And we could not have done that without the financial support from the Scottish Government, because that let me take on these cases. It helped us to make a series of videos about the concerns that were coming through our helpline, but it also helped us to helped our volunteers to engage as well. We're a small organisation. There's myself at that time. There was another caseworker, and it's mainly our trustees that do a lot of unpaid work. But that helped provide that resource as well, that they could, not that they were paid, but we needed the funding to actually do everything that I was doing.
Are you able to tell us, and please forgive me if you don't know off the top of your head, but are you able to tell us roughly how much funding you received over the?
I think it was £2,500 a month.
Thank you. You mentioned when you were speaking there the question of balance between business desires and health and safety, and I think forgive me if I'm misquoting, but I think you said later in the pandemic you were talking about the balance between business survival and health and safety. Are you able to tell us what your views are in terms of how that balance fell in the end? Do you think the balance was right, that businesses were striking, or do you feel that the balance was out of balance?
I mean, they shouldn't be doing anything that compromises the health and safety of their workforce. That's quite clear, and the law is quite clear on that. And that was our problem right throughout the pandemic. If risk assessments are not being carried out in relation to COVID, we would question if they're being carried out at all. That in itself is an offence under the Management of Health and Safety at Work Act regulations. But we're not aware of the HSE taking any action against employers proactively because they had not carried out a COVID risk assessment. And it's only very occasionally you see any action taken against them, and it's normally after an injury that they've not carried out a suitable and sufficient risk assessment.
Thank you. Can I ask you a related and slightly wider question than purely in relation to health and safety, but it is related to the balancing exercise which you obviously talked about. One of the things which His Lordship will be looking at in due course is the question of four harms. Are you familiar with that terminology?
Sorry?
Four harms. The Scottish Government during the pandemic undertook an exercise of balancing what they described as the four harms. That's direct health, indirect health matters, so COVID and general health matters, as against economic and social questions in terms of the response.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with that balancing exercise?
Well, just having... You've explained it to me briefly.
Right. Is it something you were familiar with before? Fine,
No.
Mr. Tasker, that's absolutely fine. I'd like to talk to you now, Ms. Tasker. These impact hearings are relating to business, as you know. You very kindly provided to the inquiry in your most recent statement some examples of the issues faced during the pandemic. Some of those overlap with health and social care that you discussed in May, but others are fairly unique to the business world, or there are certainly unique elements of those. And I'd like to just sort of discuss some of those with you just now, if I could. One of the things you mentioned was the definition of essential workers.
Yeah.
Are you able to tell us why that was causing a concern?
Well, I think more during the second lockdown, because the Scottish Government been quite clear, quite clear that if individuals had worked from home during the first lockdown, then they should be working from home during the second lockdown. Now, we had an example where a vulnerable worker through underlying health conditions worked for a company that provided, it provides insulation and central heating boilers, etc. And you would, and I think it's in my evidence that, yes, if your boiler's broken down during the lockdown, then that is essential that gets repaired. If a boiler is serviceable, but is perhaps nearing the end of its life, but it's still serviceable and it's not causing any problems, and it's a matter of the householder's choice if that is repaired, if that's replaced, then that's not essential. And we came across 2 or 3 cases like that where companies were actually going round houses advising that there was grants available for boiler replacement, and going into that house and asking questions about their existing boiler, etc. And one was an elderly woman who got in touch with us, and she was really quite upset at the end of the conversation she's had with this doorstep salesperson. And I said, well, that shouldn't be happening. So again, we contacted the Scottish Government, but it was hard to pin down who this salesperson was from. But going back to the other case in relation to the company, they were telling a vulnerable worker through her health condition that she had to come into work. This was during the second. This was during the second lockdown. Now, she'd been working from home during the first lockdown. The guidance was clear that she should continue to work from home, but they wanted her back into the office. Now, this involved 3 train journeys, and employers were very much, even during the lockdowns, they seemed to be very much that how you get to work is up to you. Now, vulnerable people travelling on three trains to get to work when they could be working from home, they had all the telephony to work from home. That just did not make sense, and I don't think they were exercising a duty of care to that employee. So we contacted the company, and they said that they were providing an essential service, and the admin workers were essential to that, delivering that service, which was, in our view, just not the case, particularly as he'd been working from home before. So that, I think, started a chain of events that ended up in a Sunday newspaper. And the Scottish Government got involved in that one, and it was resolved, and they were allowed, under pilot, to return to working from home.
You said there that the issue, as I please forgive me if I'm misquoting you, Mr. Tasker, but you're saying the issue was predominantly the business deciding whether or not somebody was an essential worker or not. Are you able to suggest what the alternative might have been in those circumstances?
I mean, in a lot of these circumstances, they were deciding that they were deciding what an essential worker was. They were not following any guidance in relation to what an essential worker was. They were labelling essential workers to suit their own purposes, basically, which was to get people back to work, get people back into the workplace. And there's two elements to essential work. There's actually, the essential work that the transport workers were doing, that nurses were doing, health and social care workers were doing. But there was an increasing problem in relation to essential work in people's homes, which was fitting new kitchens, for instance, which was clearly, that was not essential work. But some of the large UK-wide kitchen fitters and bathroom fitters continued to take orders during the lockdowns, and when restrictions. Well, this was the second lockdown, where most of these fitters of these kitchens are self-employed, so they'd not been working for a number of months, and this was brought to our attention by a very small company who said, and it was after the New Year, and after the second lockdown, they got in touch with us and asked if their kitchen fitters could go back to work. At that time, that was not possible. It was against the guidance. But she said, well, this company is continuing as normal. They were actually injecting savings into their company to stay afloat, but they said, we will not have our kitchen fitters back to work if this is against the guidance. So there's total difference between in that case, a small business, and what other businesses were doing that we would have said was irresponsible. I want to move on from essential workers, because you've got a lot of things. I just want to clarify one thing. When you were saying the businesses interpreting the guidance, was that an issue with the guidance not being clear, or was it an issue with businesses straining, if I can put it that way, the guidance in your view? There was a bit of both. I think in relation to working in other people's homes, that was the guidance not being clear. And when that company contacted us, the small business contacted us, we actually got in touch with the Scottish Government, and within a couple of days they'd strengthened that guidance to say that essential work had to be the circumstances that I was talking about earlier, where heating had broken down, etc. It was not about somebody coming out to check a fault in your new sofa, which is also mentioned in there, which was, it was inconvenient that something had been delivered and there was a fault in it, but it was that essential that was sorted? No.
Thank you. I want to talk briefly about a few issues that arise from working from home. You've mentioned one of them already, that you have in your statement regarding people effectively ignoring the direction to work from home, where somebody could do that. So I'll leave that one aside, if I may. Yeah. But two others that you mentioned, one was to fail to consider the mental health impacts of that working from home. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, we 2 or 3 cases where people, particularly who worked on their or lived on their own, they were contacting us to see if they could go back to work, but we said no, you can't, and you know. But you could understand why individuals wanted to get back to work if they were on their own, and they had been for a number of months. And we had others where working from home is like any other work hazard that it has to be risk assessed. And that was not the case. Now, the problem we had with the mental health of individuals who were staying on their own and working from home, and where they could not go into work, that was a hard one. That was extremely hard. But there was others where people were working from, and I had to advise one woman that worked for an estate agent that I supported what her employer was saying, because the way that she described her flat, there was no way that she could dedicate a workspace within that property, and the problem about working from home is, and a lot of employers did a lot of good work in relation to investing in technology, etc., to set it up. There was a process where you could do a risk assessment of your home online, basically, and there was a number of organisations that actually did that. The fear with individuals who were working at home was that their employer would be coming out to do that risk assessment and invading their space, basically, which is not the case. And again, it was confusion over how you put in place suitable and sufficient arrangements round about working from home. But we also, most of our cases were in relation to people who were called into workplaces that should have been working at home, and that included a call centre. I can't remember off the top of my head what they actually did, but it was an inbound call centre where really all the phones came. There was no sales involved. Well, there was sales involved, but it came as following these inbound calls. And because this department had not been reaching their targets, they were called into the workplace. All the other teams were not. Now, that was a sanction on these individuals, but bearing in mind they were travelling by public transport, etc., there could have been vulnerable workers in amongst that team. That was wrong. It was wrong. That, thankfully, was probably the worst call centre case I came across. And it was like control over they wanted to have control over their workers, but they weren't looking at what was going on round about them in relation. They obviously did not risk assess that situation about taking people back to work under these circumstances.
Thank you. The other thing that you touched upon in terms of working from home was actually returning from working from home and a failure to make suitable accommodations for vulnerable workers or people returning from isolation. Could you tell us about that?
Excuse me. Yeah, I mean, like everything else, the risk assessment process says at the very end of it, what you have to put in arrangements to review the risk assessment if it's if periodically, or if there's a material change in the circumstances that risk assessment is covering. So moving back into the workplace would automatically dictate that the COVID risk assessment is reviewed. Again, we were encouraging individuals to speak to their employer to ensure that they reviewed their risk assessment, to provide a copy of the risk assessment, to consult with the people that were returning to work. And it was not happening. And you know, the particularly among workers who had these health conditions, diabetes, you know, COPD, the ones who had previously been shielding, you have to say, you could see why they were concerned about going back to work. And we would like to think that any reasonable employer would have supported them back to work. But we came across no evidence where there was suitable support mechanisms put in place.
If I could move on from working from home, Mr. Tasker, one of the other things that you mentioned was businesses misusing travel exemption letters.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
This was, I can't remember when it was, but it was when you were, when the levels were in place, and clearly, what happened was that, again, they were deemed to be essential workers. Two of them that contacted me were actually, they were office workers, arguably working for a company that were providing essential services, but they'd been working from home previously, so our anticipation would be that would have continued. But the employers issued letters explaining that their company provided an essential service, which arguably it did, and some of them were quite detailed in relation to the arguments they put forward for that being essential work, but they didn't explain in these letters what that individual actually did. So it was, and this put workers under a lot of stress, and through Safer, the Safer Workplaces group, of which Police Scotland sat, they said, we will not be pulling people over and requesting to see their these letters. Said we will pull people over if they've got a defect in their car. We might ask them what the purpose of their journey is, and we might take some form of action. But the problem at the time was these individuals who were being encouraged to leave their homes to go to work, the liability was on them. The liability was not on the employer, which, you know, I know the STUC had a big problem with that. We had a big problem with that, as the people that were going to get into bother if it was going to happen at all were the individual workers. And our colleagues in the local authorities said it was going to be unenforceable anyway, and that was a concern that perhaps, and I can't remember the specifics, but our local authority colleagues had some concerns in relation to another area where they said what the Scottish Government was proposing was unenforceable.
Thank you. If I could turn to another area that you raised with the inquiry, Mr. Tasker, how businesses dealt with pregnant women.
Yeah, you know, I think the law says, and I think it's been changed now to ensure it's specifically for pregnant women, but the law at the time stated that if a woman advises an employer of her pregnancy, then the company should review their risk assessment, you know, to identify areas where that woman might be at higher risk of harm. And I think COVID really, I think, perhaps drove the change, but we were asking pregnant women who came to us to say, has the company reviewed their risk assessment? And they said, we don't know. So you would have to conclude from that, given that they should carry out that risk assessment or review the risk assessment in consultation with the individual, we would have to conclude that that was not done. Now, one area, we had a number of cases which we tended to look towards a maternity alliance in relation to for sources of advice, but there was a woman who contacted us, and she was a scientist working in a bioscience lab, and she contacted us in relation to the lack of a risk assessment for COVID. She was approaching the third trimester, which was the where being exposed to COVID or contracting COVID was particularly dangerous for women and the unborn child. And her employer was not reviewing the risk assessment. They'd sent her to occupational health, and the occupational health had been less than helpful. But it transpired that this woman was also working with compounds that were described as teratogens, which were compounds that were harmful to the health of unborn fetuses. And her line manager was saying that she had to continue to work with these compounds. Now, what was interesting in that case is because all her colleagues were supportive of her and said, we'll do them. But there was this issue that the line manager was adamant that she had to continue to make herself available to work with these compounds. Now, it got to the stage there where we had to say, you have to go and see your GP and get signed off and just remove yourself from that workplace. Now, that was fine because she was a professional woman. She had access to a good occupational sick pay scheme, so she was going to be okay through until her expected date of confinement. But that was not the case in other cases we dealt with. But women had to go to work because they were working for employers where it was only SSP that was payable, and they were exposed to risk as well, particularly in retail, where they were asked to carry on as normal, basically, which was checkout operation, etc. Yeah, there was screens in place, but screens were, there was some problems with screens as well, as that pathogens don't just go straight forward, they can go up and over and through gaps. So this individual was concerned about having to continue to work on the checkout, and again, the line manager was not supportive. She was expected to continue to stack shelves and that as well, that carry their own risk for pregnant women. But we got to the end of line with that one, because there was no way that the employer was going to be reasonable. The individual was not keen for us to contact the employer, and it was a national chain. But again, it was getting to the stage where she was going to have to take the decision whether she removes herself from the workplace and suffers financial hardship, or whether she continues in her job in hopes that no harm comes to her and her child.
Thank you. I'm conscious, Mr. Tasker, that we're coming towards the end of the hour that we have today. You've provided, obviously, a very full statement, and in a moment, Mr. Tasker, I'm going to give you just in the last 5 minutes if there's anything else that you want to say to His Lordship and to highlight to His Lordship. His Lordship, of course, will take into account everything that's in your statement and all the documents, or statements, I should say, and all the documents that you've provided. But if there is anything else that you want to highlight to him now, then I'll give you that opportunity to do that if you wish.
I think the only thing that we've not discussed is ventilation and workplace ventilation.
If you'd like to discuss that.
Under the workplace health, safety and welfare regulations, employers have to ensure a sufficient quantity of fresh air. Now, how they do that, it could be opening windows, etc. But there was a number of issues that came to our attention during COVID, and it was not just in old buildings, it was in new buildings like this as well. But in older buildings, a lot of the ventilation was designed through the old sash and cord windows. It was built into that was the source of the ventilation. Even when the windows were closed, ventilation got through. And we had 2 or 3 cases from people that worked in these kind of premises where the windows were actually shut. They were painted shut, and so there was no ventilation. In more modern workplaces, we were hearing, this is stuffy, and that would tend to suggest that the ventilation is not good. And that could be down to the mechanical ventilation systems not being set properly. And they were, I think, subtitles, which is the Chartered Institute of Building and Service Engineers, I think that's the name of it, they were suggesting that in order to reduce the chance of COVID spreading in these workplaces, the air changes should be between 8 and 10 an hour. If you link that to what the regulations said, there was a whole lot of confusion, and I think uncertainty in relation to employers is how do we ensure that we are delivering the right level of ventilation. And this is no criticism of employers, because it's something that people were not aware of. They were not aware that they had to provide that. They should have been, but they were not aware that they had that obligation to provide that quantity of fresh air. And, really, I think, moving forward, we have to ensure that people are aware of airflow and air movement within their workplaces, because that was clearly an opportunity for pathogens to travel throughout. And we had offices where their system worked on a recirculating basis, where bad air was being sucked out of one place and pumped into another one. So I think I just noticed that there is a Scottish Pandemic Science Partnership being set up, and hopefully that's in preparation for any other pandemic, that ventilation will be very much part of that. That we look at, and I think the HSE should be involved in this, is how they ensure that provision within the regulations to provide that quantity of fresh air is actually happening. And the other thing is that, having learned of that Scottish Pandemic Science Partnership, I think we have to look at whether there should be a similar thing for business. A Scottish Business Pandemic Partnership involving trade unions, involving employers, doesn't have to meet as frequently as the Safer Workplaces group, but to be prepared for anything in the future, it's better to be prepared, and that should include all stakeholders, not just the scientists.
Thank you, Mr. Tasker. My Lord, I have no further questions unless your Lordship has anything to add.
No, just to say thank you, Mr. Tasker, and that brings this week's
Thank you, my
proceedings
Lord.
to an end. Monday at 10 o'clock.
Thank you, my Lord.